but most of what we see is post-traumatic reactions. But the psychological phenomena behind it is similar, which is that trauma persists. We don't let go of it. And the protective measures, we don't let go of too easily. Another question, so let me just take a quick look. Okay, so this is a question that, and by the way, I'm glad you mentioned, you can ask chat questions in two different ways. You can just have it public where everybody sees your question, but if you want to ask a question privately, then I'll just read the question. I won't divulge, of course, who are the people who asked the question. If you don't even want the question asked, if you just want to send me a message of some sort, please note that in the chat. So there's the private question, this seems to be more about younger grades, also applied to junior high, and at which level. So in terms of the tenacity of trauma, yes, I think it applies across the grades. Maybe a bit more so with younger children. Again, younger children are more vulnerable. Younger children are more dependent on parents. So if a parent, let's say, gets sick or dies, in the trauma component is more profound because they're little people in a big dangerous world, and now they have one less protective figure. On the other hand, the teenager, and I did not go into developmental yet, how different age groups will respond to this, and if maybe that's something, again, if there's an interest, I can include it in the next talk, or if we have time at the end, I'll address it then. But the teenager will have first of all, can have the continuation of the trauma. Also, in terms of socializing, I think I mentioned this later, the social component, the social distancing and being wrenched apart from their peers is far more profound for the teenager than is for the younger child. The younger children have friends and they like being among their friends, but for the teen, there's a shift, a natural developmental shift from a primary focus on the family to a primary focus or an equal focus, let's say, on the peer group, culminating obviously in picking from your peer world the closest friend you'll ever have, i.e. a husband and a wife. So the peers are very important to the preteen and to the teenager, and the limited or diminished contact with the peer group had a much more profound effect on teenagers than it did on younger children. But the pure traumatic piece, probably more so on younger children. But I will try to address cross ages, and if I leave something out, please feel free to bring that up. Thank you for asking. Okay, so there is the limited research that we do have in terms of the psychological impact on quarantine is that that demonstrates that the anxiety and cautionary behaviors of quarantine persist even when the danger has subsided. So even, for example, in the SARS epidemic, which was much smaller, but there was data from 2004, this was collected mostly in Toronto, demonstrated that people were, when there was an immunity established, no longer danger, people were still acting as if the danger exists. Now, so why is that? So again, we have to keep in mind that if we're talking about personal comfort, or if we're talking about something recreational, we may want it, but it's not integral to our survival. If you're in a dangerous situation, the behaviors that you have to adopt to keep yourself safe and prevent yourself from being in a dangerous situation are not ones that you're going to give up too easily, because it's survival. So therefore, it very quickly and in a very profound way gets embedded into your mind, and you hold on to it. In fact, for example, one of the very perplexing symptoms of post-trauma, so I mentioned PTSD before, but post-trauma is what we refer to as flashbacks, that people who have been through a traumatic situation have constantly, almost like photographs of the situation that come back and enter into their consciousness. And there are a few reasons for flashbacks, but one of them is, well, different theories, but one of them is because, again, it's safety. And therefore, the brain will not let us forget it because we have to learn to take precautionary measures to avoid it. So it tends to stick. And therefore, we, even if, let's say now our children are coming back to school, they may be coming back to school in a region of the country where there may not, maybe on the brink of a herd immunity. I don't want to venture guess, that's for the experts. But more importantly, are going back to a school that is now had several months to develop precautionary measures and to prevent, to take the necessary steps to stop any kind of danger. And yet many of the children may act, others may act differently. Many children may act as if this hasn't made a difference, and there is still a great danger. I was actually speaking today to a very prominent physician who's on the committees that are helping schools determine what standards they should have, and he was telling me he can't sleep at night because, let's say, he thinks that certain amount of freedom is allowed with necessary precautions. What if he's wrong, and what would be the consequences? And that's giving him sleepless nights. Again, we're talking about survival and danger, and therefore the response can be more profound. There's another reality, and again here she says, your mother just wants to let you know that she's finally over her postpartum depression. In general, this is a general principle that I think you need to understand in general dealing with children, is that the brain is much slower than reality. Our very often reality changes, but until we adjust our perceptions and our way of understanding things, it takes a lot longer. If I can give you a simple example, if you know anybody or if you yourself had been in a situation where, let's say, a person who had been quite obese, very overweight, and finally the doctor, reads him or her the Riot Act, and they go on one of these, I know they're higher nutritionists, they go on these extreme diets and they lose 100 pounds or 150 pounds. And now they look slim and healthy. They'll look in the mirror and they'll say, I see a fat person. Because your self-identity as a fat person changes much slower than the reality of the weight that is lost. And that's so the same thing we can anticipate as children return to school, that the reality is, it might be in the particular region where you are, that the cases are much lower. The reality may be also equally important, that we have a much better understanding of this illness and its impact, and therefore we know better how to protect one another, but the brain may not quite be there yet. And by the way, that's part of the flip side of what we see, which we're going to get to later as well, which is some of the very discrepant responses. And there are subsets of our community, I'm going to say this without an iota of judgment, but there are subsets of the community that are having a very hard time accepting the changes. A line I hear a lot from people, and we've been very busy at OHIL consulting with schools and communities and individuals, is I want my kids to have normal lives. I want my kids to play with friends, to be in school, to go to camp, to play ball. I want them to do everything, and for good reason. We've had a wonderful life, and they're having a very hard time accepting the fact that at least for a while there's a new reality, and there may even be some permanent aspects that the reality will change. So again, keep in mind that the brain changes much slower than reality does. Okay, any questions? Okay, please feel free to ask. Okay, delayed response. All right, you were struck with the enthusiasm and ease with which the students adapted to the school year after all the tension, excuse me, and disruption of the end of the last academic year. It therefore caught you by surprise when the more anxious children and those whose families had been infected started becoming distracted and overtly worried around November and December. Why did that happen? And again, this is a very common phenomena when we're dealing with traumatic and painful events, is that sometimes the reaction is delayed. There's a dormant period during which there is not a reaction, and the reaction comes later, and particularly comes, that's why I think important in terms of school, around November and December. As you as teachers know, that's first of all when it gets cold, it gets dark, it gets rainy, and there is the day in and day out routine without the anticipation of much of a break. And we start now, yeshivas, we start now in the next week or so, and in 4 weeks is Rosh Hashanah, and in 5 weeks is Sukkot, is Yom Kippur Sukkot. You barely got your feet wet and you're ready back home. And there's the newness of school and the excitement of being back in school. And that can sort of override and eclipse some of the trauma and the fear. when things get back into a routine, that's very often when it emerges. So again, dormant pre-traumatic responses can emerge even months or even years later, especially when there are pragmatic needs and concerns. And again, here's a guy getting a ticket and he says, to be frank, officer, my parents never set boundaries. Not something I would recommend trying. But now why is that? In fact, just to give some dramatic examples of the dormant period with trauma, Holocaust survivors who were traumatized in such a fashion that they needed mental health services only started showing up in psychiatrists' offices in the mid-50s. They were liberated in the mid-40s. Or Vietnam War veterans only started showing up in VA hospitals with issues of alcoholism and domestic violence in the early 80s. The war was over in the early 70s. And the reason for that, and again, this can be relevant here as well, maybe not quite as dramatic, but the reason for that is that let's take the Holocaust survivor. They had nothing. They lost their entire family. They lost their home. They literally had to rebuild a life from scratch. They had to find any relative who may have survived, had to find some place to live. As you know, not many countries were terribly hospitable. And they had to get married and build a family. And by the mid-50s, when, let's say, if they came to America and they were established, they had a home, they had a job, they had kids, that's when the trauma hit them. Because the brain very adaptively can park the trauma when practical matters are necessary, when you have to take care of practical issues. So we sometimes have this where the trauma hits you. And by the way, it's very confusing to the victim because I figured, okay, I should have had it right away. Why am I having this response later on? And again, the reason is because practical matters have to be attended to. So now let's translate that back to the children coming back to school. Well, they've been out of school now for 6-7 months. It's a very different looking school that they're coming to. They've had this very perplexing and frightening time period in the middle, and they have to adjust now to this new setting, the new teacher, the new types of books, the new subject material, adjust again to some of the regimentation. If it's a hybrid model of going in 2-3 days and doing Zoom 2-3 days, they have to adjust this whole new way of schooling. So sometimes the trauma gets parked and gets put away. And there's an excitement. They're seeing their friends they haven't seen in a while, and the beginning, usually in the early first few weeks of school, teachers are keeping pretty light, and especially this year, because as we're going to talk about probably next time, you have to sort of reintroduce the structure and regimentation of the classroom to the children. So they're not going to necessarily allow the emergence of the past trauma to come in. Once you get back into that routine, comes November, December, you're back in the routine, you got the hang of it, you know how it's working with new system, you're hand sanitizing without thinking about it, you're having social distancing lunch periods in your classroom, it becomes normal, wearing masks when you're out of the classroom, and then that's when the memories, and that's when they come back and they haunt you after this kind of delay. So again, you may walk into the classroom in September and things look great, and in actuality, then to your amazement, see some of the more adverse reactions later on in, let's say, as I said, in November, December. Okay, again, I welcome people to ask questions or raise points in the chat. Okay, now this is a very important point that we have emphasized a great deal as we address communities and schools with the issue of the quarantine. Okay, 12-year-old Esty has manifested problems with her temper since she is a toddler. It never used to take much for her to get disproportionately angry over the smallest slight or insult. Through tireless efforts of her parents, Esty has learned to largely contain her anger or displace it elsewhere. Since the pandemic and quarantine, she has, in no time, regressed back to her old habits of fighting and screaming, even more so than she had in the past. Why is that happening? Okay. Next scenario. While Mr. and Mrs. S have basically a good marriage, they have distinct differences in parenting style. Mr. S is much more willing to give in to the children, while Mrs. S is more of the disciplinarian. For the sake of shalom bayis, they have worked it out by having Mrs. S do most of the parenting and Mr. S stays out of her way. Now quarantined, they are more openly arguing and undermining one another. Why is this happening now? Okay, Eliezer is literally gifted in his interpersonal sensitivity and social acumen. His parents often marvel at how insightful he can be for a 9-year-old and know how to say just the right thing when someone is upset. Now that the family is struggling with the stress of the pandemic and quarantine, Eliezer's mom doesn't know how they'd manage without him. Without acting nerdy or inappropriate, he skillfully calms down agitated children and even seems to know what to say when his parents are overwrought with financial pressures, worries about their parents, and the like. This is a side of him they never saw before. What is bringing that out? Now, this is a very important point to understand, not only about this situation, but I think it's really important to understand in general in terms of emotional reactions or even trauma reactions. It's very rare that a singular event will so radically change a person or will create in the person a condition that hasn't either been there, either dormant or in actuality. In other words, what happens to us when we're in challenging situations is it brings out either the worst or the best in us. And that's why that's, if you notice the title, I said, what was will be more so. So, and that, as I said, goes for conditions, talent, and relationships. So in other words, for example, some of the webinars that we needed to do over the course of this pandemic was for staff in the hospitals, nursing homes. And one of the points that we had to make is that tolerable political issues, competition, friction, that, might have flared up once in a while, but can pretty much be, shoved under the carpet, is now going to come out. I mean, if they're really on the front lines, maybe not, because they'll be too busy trying to save lives, but may come out all the more so. So relationship issues are either, in other words, the strong relationships, the very supportive relationships will become all the stronger and more supportive, but the friction that even may not have been an issue before will become all the more so because of this. But the important point is, it's not that a constitutionally and inherently very say calm and rational person will now suddenly become this overly anxious person because of the pandemic, but somebody who may have a propensity towards anxiety, or somebody who may be very reactive, or let's say somebody has a propensity towards depression, it's going to be amplified because of these events. Or for that matter, again, as I said, it applies to strengths as well, that the coping mechanisms that we have, our if you will, our emotional metal, our emotional muscles will get bigger as we deal with them. I mean, you can see the best and the worst coming out. Okay, so again, let me just, sorry, 1 second. So stress doesn't create a particular response, but more likely, it should have said, actualize and amplifies tendencies that were previously present, even if dormant. And by the way, a very important part then, let's say for yourselves, and one of the messages we've been giving to people is know yourself. Know your coping mechanism, know what works for you, because that which does is going to be, you're going to be relying on it more. So if you really are by nature someone who handles emergencies very well, or if you are by nature somebody who, when you're in a difficult situation, can very successfully and effectively research it and understand it, that's going to come out even all the more. But if you are someone who gets overwrought or he gets distracted, then that's going to get greater. So that's important to know yourself, to see, again, especially as you're working together, and that might even imply even in a school during these very difficult times, to know your strengths, to know your vulnerabilities, to therefore prevent the vulnerabilities getting in the way, or seeking out assistance for the vulnerabilities, but also maximizing what are your strengths as a teacher. This applies to emotional vulnerabilities, interpersonal relationships, coping mechanisms, and even strengths. And here's a line I use in therapy, and I think it sort of captures that as well. I often tell my patients, I'm not going to change you. I'm going to make you better at who you are. Because I can't change people. I can't change people's basic nature. People's basic nature is very ingrained. Some of it is even genetic. But I can help you based on who you naturally are to be better at that person. Okay, any questions? Oh yeah, there is. That's only good. I'm glad I checked. Let me just quickly. Okay. How the teacher achieve normalcy in the classroom where some students are Zooming and some are in the classroom with uncomfortable masks. Okay, I think I'm going to try to get to that a little bit tomorrow. I have to confess I'm not an educator. My entire educational experience, to be honest with you, was very early in my career. I was the school psychologist at the Hebrew Academy of Long Beach, and there was a 20-minute time period where there was nobody to cover the 8th grade boys, and the principal apologetically asked me to cover the 8th grade boys for 20 minutes. I will admit that afterwards I benched Geimel, and I was very grateful that I never went into chinuch. So I can't give you those kind of points, but we will try to talk at least psychologically. But really what people talk about, to be honest with you, is the new normal. That's going to become a very normal way of life, just like in Sderot, running for shelter when the siren goes off is the normal way of living. You know, and by the way, nobody more easily adapts and adjusts to new challenges than children. Children's lives are governed by constantly reading new challenges and having new situations. So they will probably quicker than us adults adjust to this mask wearing and Zooming, although there'll be some kids for whom it's more particularly difficult, and I'm going to get into that as we go along. Okay. Okay, the invisible invader. At the first day back at school, you're reviewing with your second graders the new health practices and precautions. During recess, Miri, a bright but somewhat timid child, approaches in and in a near whisper asks, "Can we see corona if it is in the class?" Now, this is what makes this situation particularly stressful. If the danger was, let's say, I mentioned Sderot before, if the danger was the encroachments of rockets, as scary as that might be, and I in no way mean to minimize it, it's something you can see. It's something you can sort of quantify. What makes this coronavirus so destabilizing is that it's, for most of us, to the naked eye, it's invisible. And so it's kind of there and we can't see it. And that's true, by the way, more so obviously for children, especially young children who need concrete, who respond better to concrete evidence, if you will, but even to adults. So part of what makes this so particularly stressful, and that's, I think, part of what you might be facing is the kids are going to say, how do we know? Where is it? Is it there? Do people have it? How do I know that the child who walked by me in the hallway and didn't happen to have a mask on, how do I know that they're not breathing out this virus? And again, we have the added problem, which I'm going to allude to later, that even medical experts are confounded by many aspects of this coronavirus. Okay, next is a child's question. This is one of my favorites. The child wrote that 7 times 5 is 75, and he says to teacher, it may be wrong, but it's how I feel. Very much children today. But on the first day back to school, as the principal announced the rules about social distancing and wearing masks, one child raises her hand. She asks if the coronavirus is quote unquote gone. If it is, why do we still need precautions? And if it isn't, why are we back in school? So again, as children in particular like things kind of, especially younger children. Again, because previously I was asked about teens, and maybe I've been remiss in not focusing more on teens. Teenagers are much better with subtleties. Teenagers are also have a more profound understanding. They can think in abstractions. So they can understand a danger that they can't sort of put their finger on and touch. And they can understand gradations, that there are different levels of danger. Younger children are more sort of black and white, more sort of one extreme or the other. So it may be confusing to some of the children. And added to that, and I think this is a stressor that we have to consider as we talk about this, is that there has been a lot of inconsistency in our community. There are many people who really believe that this is just a political ploy, or really nearly as dangerous as everybody's making it, and others are taking much more precautionary measures. And these mixed messages or these mixed findings and I'm not weighing in on who's right and who's wrong, but can be very more confusing to children who cannot, don't have that understanding that there can be merit to different positions. So again, this may be an issue with a child who may see things in more polarized ways. If there is corona, why are we back in school? If there isn't, why are we wearing masks and social distancing? And that's a harder question. I mean, again, we have to explain it to them, and we'll talk about that, but that might be harder. Or for that matter, if you have children coming from different communities and one is exercising extreme precautions, the other one is acting as if nothing's there. And how do you coordinate? One of the most common questions that we've got asked by parents during all this was going on is, what do I do when my child wants to socialize and we want him to wear a mask and not go within 6 feet, and all his friends have no masks on and are playing ball and are on top of each other, hugging and kissing, and I don't want my kid to be excluded. How do I do that? Or for that matter, that we have a member of our family who's immune deficiency, who may not have, may be much more at risk. And therefore we want to practice more extreme precautions, and people around me are not practicing those same extreme precautions, and that might come up as an issue as children return to school. So first of all, I think this is a very important point and touches very much on this situation here in school. There's a large body of research how low tolerance for ambiguity leads to stress and resorting to totalitarian stereotypical options in a search for certainty. In other words, Chazal said it perfectly, and as is so often the case, Ein simcha ka'ataras hasfeikus, that there is a comfort when you know, when you have certainty, and when there is ambiguity. And the ambiguity can take many forms. The ambiguity can be, we don't quite understand this disease. The ambiguity can be, what's the right way to approach it? Is it over and we can just socialize like we did before? Or should we continue to exercise precautions? Or the ambiguity, can be we just don't understand it. Or the ambiguity can be that we're sort of saying come back to school, but we're still saying there have to be precautions. People are comforted by certainty, and sometimes a lot of what happens in situations such as this, where we have this very perplexing pandemic, is people are flocking or rushing for certainty. They're looking for something, to be more sure of themselves, and therefore that's why we see sometimes people sort of rushing to conclusions that may not be warranted. And if you follow the responsible medical sites, very often many of the physicians and many of the experts will say, we don't really understand. We don't really know. Research seems to show this, but then there's a study that shows this. They still can't wrap their hands around this. And by the way, in today's world, we have a very hard time with this. Not only do people in general have a hard time with this, but we are used to certainty. We live in the time of technology and very advanced scientific findings. And we think that if you click a mouse enough, you're gonna get an answer to any question. You might have a complicated mathematical or business, let's say, calculation, and in 3 seconds the computer can do it for you. So the fact that we have this pandemic that's so affecting our lives, and we're standing and we're confounded, is very hard for many of us in today's world to accept. The thing that patients, parents waiting for consequential test results, this is something that we have seen very frequently as we counsel traumatic patients. And I'll just sort of give an example. Imagine somebody, lo aleinu, who has cancer, and surgery is done to remove the tumor. And the key question is, has it spread to the lymph nodes? Has the tumor spread? And very often it takes a while until the results are known. It has to go to a laboratory, it has to be examined and tested, and it could be a week, could be 2 weeks before the results come back. And even when results come back, and Rahman al-Islam, they're bad results. It's positive for cancer, it's negative results, but it's positive cancer, and the cancer has spread. Many patients and family members will say that was easier than that 2-week wait, because that uncertainty, that sort of being in that, like, you never know, you don't know what's going to be, in itself engenders a lot of anxiety. And so therefore, a lot of the anxiety that we're going to see in our children is the absence of certainty. And a lot of it is legitimate. And In this case, as I said earlier, you have an easier time with teenagers. Teenagers can understand that there can be many versions of reality. There can be there can be different theories. And it doesn't mean necessarily one's more right than the other. But younger children like things, absolutely. I still remember working once with a child with a lot of ADHD. I mean, that might have been some bearing. I mean, he was really struggling with his impatience. Bright, well-meaning, good kid. But, and they were learning Baba Metzia, and they were learning the sugya of Yesh Shlomi Das, which is, I don't even remember how many dafim it was, and this opinion, that opinion, back. And finally, at the end, it said Teku. And he came into my office, and he was furious. It was so hard for him to follow it all. And that's what you come up with afterwards, Teku? That's much harder for a child to tolerate. Okay. All right. When you returned to school this September, you were struck by the diversity of responses from your students. Some seemed extremely anxious and worried, refusing to remove their masks, even when allowed, scream and run away when someone got too close, and were hand sanitizing all day. In contrast, others were mocking all the safety precautions and needed constant reminders to follow school guidelines. In the middle were those who did what they were told, demonstrated awareness that precautions are necessary, but never overwhelmed or distraught. How do you explain the diversity of responses? So keep this in mind. I'm going to do one or two more, and then we'll discuss this because this is a very important point. Okay, too little anxiety. And again, the guy says, you want the sign to read The World Ends Tomorrow. When do you have to have it? Okay, Donnie was always one of the overly confident and obstinate children who'd occasionally need to be reprimanded or humbled. On the first day back to school, and as the principal was specifying hygienic and precautionary measures, Donnie could be seen making jokes and mimicking coughing on his friends. Even as the year began, it often seems that Donnie purposely, quote unquote, forgot to sanitize or put on a mask. Why is he like that? Okay, so these vignettes capture some very important point in terms of understanding anxiety. Most of us are inclined to look at anxiety, and anxiety is the most common response, obviously, to this situation. Most of us tend to look at anxiety as sort of like an illness that we have to get rid of. A little bit like, let's say, a strep throat. There's no benefit to having strep throat. If you have a child that has strep throat, you have to take the doctor, you have to give them an antibiotic and get rid of it. Many people look at anxiety like that. But anxiety, as is true, by the way, of many psychological conditions, in moderation is necessary and is useful. And so therefore, or for that matter, having too little anxiety is dangerous, because anxiety is a way in which we stay safe. You know, for example, if you're walking down the street and a very hungry lion is running towards you, you're going to experience anxiety, or, you know, maybe call it more fear, and you're going to run away or I'm sorry, I'm just having a problem with my computer. Give me a second, please. Hold on a second. There we go. You're going to run away or take, you know, necessary precautionary measures to ensure your safety. But having that fear and having that capacity to be frightened was useful, and it really helped save your life, if you will. So the tricky thing with anxiety, especially as we live in these kind of dangerous times, is not to have too much and not to have too little, but to have the right amount. So for example, in a study of children taking mathematics exams, researchers found that those with too little or too much, too much anxiety tended to falter or get low grades. So in other words, if you're taking a test, this is a basic point. If you're so anxious that you can't think straight, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to get a poor grade. If you're not anxious enough, if you just don't care, you're not motivated to study, you're not motivated to try hard, you're going to get a low grade. So the optimal level of anxiety taking a test is to have a modicum of anxiety. Enough anxiety that you're going to study and you're going to work hard and try to know the material, but not so much so that you get so overwrought. And the same thing is true with this pandemic, especially as children come back to school, and we want to make sure that they're precautionary measures. The important thing is that children have that medium level of anxiety. I'll take a quick look to see how many chats. No, okay. Again, everybody's welcome to ask questions. So again, that's Charlie Brown, my anxieties have anxieties. So moderate anxiety is optimal for academics or vocational success. Challenging times such as pandemics require maintaining levels of anxiety commensurate with the threat. Ironically, that may mean decreasing or increasing a child's anxiety. So when you're preparing children to take the necessary precautionary measures to remain safe, for some children may come with the right level of anxiety. They're concerned, so they remember to keep their masks on, they remember to socially distance, they remember to be, wash their hands, and etc., or to stay home if they're not feeling well, etc. Some may have too much anxiety and are too worried, and ironically are probably putting themselves in more danger because they're not thinking straight, whereas others may have too little anxiety. And this is the type of child that we don't pay attention to enough. I know I remember when lockdown drills became much more, unfortunately, part of intruder drills for schools. Many schools called us down, and especially the school-based team, but to come down and help. Obviously, we couldn't address the security issues, but to address how to give this over to the children without making them overly distraught. And I could so easily spot the kid with too little anxiety, because that was the kid who was making a joke about it and was making believe he's a shooter and acting up because he doesn't like to be made anxious. And that's the kind of kid that you have to scare, because he needs to be afraid. And here too, he has to be afraid, because I think there's a general consensus that there's still a danger and precautionary measures are necessary. So the job of the teacher, if you will, is to help achieve that medium level for every child of anxiety and worry, but not so much so that they get overly distraught. Now, of course, again, let me get back to what I mentioned earlier about what has been, will be, which is that the kid who has a tendency towards too much anxiety, the kid who has an anxiety disorder, or may have been in therapy for anxiety, or just is by nature anxious, is the kid that you're going to have to worry about being overly distraught. The kid who just, who'll climb the tallest tree and there's no roller coaster that's frightening enough for him and, doesn't like to be made anxious, is the kid who you may have to scare, because some anxiety is necessary. I actually found this to be a very interesting study, fairly recent one. By the way, it's about skydivers. So the famous quote, if at first you don't succeed, skydiving's not for you. But it was a study of skydivers, and they were studied the brain activity of reckless individuals. And they found that it more resembled that of the intimidated and scared rather than those who knowingly took risks. So in other words, if you could divide up potential first-time skydivers between those who were too scared, too frightened, who had very high levels of anxiety, or those who just were making believe they were taking a walk in the park as they're jumping out of a plane 20,000 feet in the air, their brain activity were more similar. You would never expect that. Than those who were in the middle, who had a proper amount of fear, so they were checking if everything worked, but not so much so that they were able to jump out of the plane. And so their conclusion was that what matters is not the presence or absence of courage, but the ability to accurately perceive and judge a potential threat. It was a very interesting perspective in terms of understanding anxiety, that it's not the presence, if you will, of biochemical markers or presence just of extreme courage or fear, but how to assess an actual danger. So again, and that might speak to, in terms of educating children, so that they get a sort of a realistic sense of what's dangerous and what's not. I see some chats came up, so let me look at those. Okay. All right. Okay, so the kid who has too much anxiety, how do we go about guiding him? Okay, and then the similar question, how do we handle the overly anxious child? So I'm kind of, just for the sake of time, I'm focusing more on what poses the challenges, and I hope tomorrow to talk about the ways in which we do it. But for the overly anxious child, now, if it morphs into an anxiety disorder, you make a referral. If it's within the norm, but a little too much anxious, then you can impart, and by the way, we're more and more, I'm gonna probably talk about this more tomorrow, we're more and more deputizing teachers to be sort of our therapists. I mean, OL has an anxiety program with, I believe, 3 or 4 schools where we are training teachers to recognize high levels of anxiety, but not so extreme that need therapeutic assistance, and giving them techniques to help calm the child down. But it might mean teaching a child to reflect. That might mean giving a child the realistic perspective, giving them some image or understanding of what threat exists, giving them the confidence in the adults. That's become very important. Again, we'll talk about this probably more tomorrow, to give them the assuredness that the adults know what they're doing. And by the way, very important, which I'm probably going to come back to again and again, particularly with younger children, is it doesn't matter sometimes what you say, but the tone of voice, your tone, voice, and body language. Because the scared young child is listening to that more than the actual words. When I have to go into a school post-trauma and I have to sort of try to help the children achieve some more calm and sense of safety, I act very sure of myself. When I leave, I fall apart. But I act very certain and sure of myself because they're going to, in their mind, is saying this expert comes, and if there's a quiver in his voice and he's not too sure, and he sounds anxious, then there's really something to be scared of. So that becomes very important, the manner in which, and that's in general, with especially younger children. How you say it sometimes is more important than the actual words that you use. I hope that answers the question. If not, please resubmit the question. I'll tell me why it hasn't. Okay, so what is the ambiguity of this? We mentioned ambiguity breeds anxiety. It's the invisible nature of the threat, which we covered. The lack of consensus in the community at large, even from one family to another. You can have, next door neighbors, siblings who love each other to pieces, and one has one level of caution, the other has the other. And it is a very big problem that there is such discrepancy. I mean, it's unfortunately very Jewish, it's the 2 Jews and 3 opinions, but it is exacerbating anxiety, exacerbating some of the sense of, if somebody's, please mute your phone, but the sense of camaraderie and sense of safety that comes safety in numbers. If we were all sort of in sync with one another, that may be just too much to ask, and partly, and again, also the next point, so much that the medical experts don't yet understand. That makes it complicated because we can't even go to, if we go to some of the, what would be considered reputable sites, then you're still going to get a very sort of mixed or confused kind of response. And then, by the way, the different circumstances, presence of family, immune-compromised family who had disease and antibodies, those who lost loved ones. So you're having a lot of discrepancy, and that contributes to ambiguity because there isn't a sort of clear response. I see that there's another chat that came up. So let me just quickly look at that one. Okay, very good. Interesting. I never knew this. When Levi Eshkol spoke to the Israeli people to calm them down about the Six-Day War, he scared the living daylights out of everyone because he stammered. That's interesting, and that's the point. And you want people, especially when they're scared, they want that certainty. I don't want to sound boastful, but I remember there was a family that went through a tragedy that I once assisted, and I was speaking in their neighborhood. So they came to hear my speech, but they came a little bit late. And the mother said to me afterwards that when she heard my voice, she felt her blood pressure going down because she associated me with reducing tension. But it shows you how you can be responsive to a voice. But I never heard that, and that's an excellent example. I will cite it in future speeches. Okay, anxiety and intelligence, something you may not have necessarily connected. As you prepare to return to school and orient the children to the new precautionary measures and practices, you're relieved to see that 2 of your students scored extremely high on the IQ test administered last year. It caught you totally by surprise that they proved to be the most frightened and concerned, constantly coming up with new worries and concerns. Okay, I repeated concerns, I apologize. This is an interesting phenomena that when we look to identify vulnerable children in situations like this, we tend to look at a high intelligence as an asset. And in many respects it is, but it's also can be cause for a lot of anxiety. In fact, there was a Sunday Times article, I think about maybe 10 years ago, that identified certain great, inventors and, great scientists who had terrible anxiety and worked so hard to sort of relieve that. I think they really focused mostly on Darwin. But high IQ is associated with higher anxiety. And again, we don't have to look further than Koheles, where it says Yosef Das, Yosef Machov, towards the end of the first parak of Koheles, it says, more knowledge comes more pain. And there is a correlation between intellectual giftedness and anxiety. And intellectual, and that's again something you have to understand, that an intellectual prowess is not just being smarter. And that's a mistake sometimes we make. In fact, sometimes maybe a teacher not familiar with the literature on intellectual giftedness will think, well, this person's very smart, I'm going to give them more material. But that's not what they need. They need different kinds. They need to think. That the very bright child needs to use their brain. Any kind of talent is a hunger. I remember reading a book once about, I think it was by Herrick Smith, about the Russians during the 70s and when the Soviet Jewry movement was starting. And they described when Baryshnikov, who had requested to leave the Soviet Union, was confined to his tiny apartment. And the reporter described that here's a man who could leap across the stage. And he was in this tiny apartment, how that was torture enough that he couldn't use his skill and his talent. The same thing is true with intellectual kids. So they're going to read a lot, and they're going to think a lot, and they're going to examine it. And they're not going to just be happy with pat answers. They will have, by the time you come back to school, read already 10, 15 articles about, about the pandemic, and are going to have questions, auras, and to read into it. So again, one of the concerns as you're returning to school, and one of the potential, of course, all our children are gifted and they're all brilliant, but the exceptionally exceptional children may be more prone to anxiety. Okay, so is anxiety communicable? Is it contagious? Okay, the orientation for 7th grade girls to all the new protocols of safety measure was going very well until Chaya and Miriam started asking questions. You're aware that both of them have been in therapy for anxiety. With their characteristic pressured and frantic way of talking, they question some of the practices and share stories from Israel and Canada of schools that endanger children and adults by opening too early. You are able to provide assurances to them, but by now the rest of the class appears highly anxious and distraught. Why? And this is an important point to understand and might have some bearing in terms of the manner and fashion in which you prepare the children for the new standards, which is that anxiety is contagious. And this is now, and we have to understand that. Yes, while many emotional states impact on others, few if any are as contagious as anxiety. In other words, if you're around someone with depression, it may evoke in you a certain morosity, a certain sadness. That can happen. And if you're around someone who may be, let's say, paranoid or something, it might evoke in you, because when we're with people, we connect to them and bring out parts of ourselves. But there's probably very few conditions that are as contagious as an anxiety. And that's for very good reasons, because anxiety, that goes back to what I spoke about earlier about children who may have too little or too much anxiety, which is that anxiety is a safety measure. Anxiety is an assurance of survival. Let's go back to Middle Ages, right? And people lived in walled cities or something like that, and some invader is coming. The capacity of, let's say, the sentry, the guard, to arouse anxiety in those people living within the walls was necessary in order to assure their protection. So our survival depends on anxiety being contagious. Now that works well when there is a danger, and we have to get people to be mobilized quickly. But again, this pandemic is a new situation. But in situations where where there's a danger, there isn't so much of a danger, we can very easily get anxious. So if you have a class and there are even one or two members of the classroom who are terribly anxious and are manifesting that anxiety can be very easily picked up by the other children, and may be necessary to sort of contain their anxiety or to offer them to speak to them separately and not in the context of the classroom. But again, from an adaptive evolutionary perspective, it's essential for safety to transmit fear to others. Our capacity to pass on fear to someone else, for that matter, our capacity to pass on fear to other children, believe it or not, we do it all the time. So for example, the first time one of your toddlers started or even actually walked into the street, we scared the living daylights out of them. Rightfully so. It ensured their safety and security, that you don't just wander into the street. So we probably scared the living daylights out of them. And we do this all the time when we teach about not getting near strangers, when we teach fire drills. We're transmitting fear to children so that they will be mobilized and take necessary precautions and not get into any kind of dangerous situation. But then there can be other situations where the contagion will be harmful. By the way, this speaks to, which is something I will be speaking to a little bit more tomorrow, which is the necessity to make sure you're calm or you have the appropriate level of alertness and concern before you try to give it over to children or students. Okay, any questions? No, okay. Okay, Shimon is not a particularly good student and needs ongoing assistance to barely keep up. His claim to fame is his athleticism, particularly in basketball. Often his prowess and skills in sports makes up for his frustration and shame in the classroom. Since COVID, games that entail such close proximity with exerted breathing are not allowed. Is it possible and indicated to make this up to Shimon? Okay, next question, because these are all related. Okay, Shoshana is an average and obedient student. She is also the ultimate social butterfly. Not only is she immensely popular, but is in her full glory around friends who simply adore her. The social distancing that has been simply unbearable. What can be done? In contrast to Shoshana, Rachel is a superb student and bookworm who loves learning. Socially, she is often withdrawn and shy. She would much rather spend days off buried in a book than socializing. This quarantine period has been perfect for her, and her parents have rarely seen her so at ease with herself. Should she be encouraged to now start socializing, albeit with distance, or allow her the reprieve that she has enjoyed these past few months? So when we try to, okay, I'm sorry, I did one more vignette and then we'll get on. Okay, online panic. Many of the boys in your fourth grade class use the internet, excuse me, use the internet for learning what is going on in the world, and social media for connecting widely to peers. You are sensing that such an influx of information and awareness of any and all resurgence of COVID is creating disproportionate levels of fear and concern. Should you suggest to the parent body curtailing their use of these media or encourage them to limit their on-site access? So, you know something? I think, hold on a second. Okay. I'm sorry. I left out a slide here. So let me go back to those first three, okay? This was, I'm sorry, it was not, this was an oversight. So I think the main point is, varying from child to child, the quarantine and required social distancing is going to have a varying kind of impact depending on the kid. A kid for whom socializing, or for that matter, in the case of the first one, the kid for whom athletic games and you know, playing sports in close proximity is the compensation for what's lacking otherwise, now telling them that they can't play basketball is not just depriving them of a sort of form of recreation. It's taking away their capacity to feel good about themselves. And this is an important point that we have to consider. I remember when I used to do evaluations in schools, and I would assess for learning disabilities, and I would identify, let's say, a child who had a particular learning disability. And I would meet with the parents, and I would talk about the various kinds of remediation that the child is going to need. And of course, they're saying the cash register is going off. They're trying to figure out how they're going to afford all this kind of tutoring and this assistance. And then when we were just about done, I would say to them something like, and by the way, he's very musical, get him music lessons. And look at me and said, why? The one thing he's good at, I have to get him some. He said, yeah, because school's going to be a struggle for him. And what are we saying to him that he needs all this extra assistance? Excuse me. So by providing him with with assistance in the areas where he's strong, we're making up for the slight in self-esteem. But with this pandemic and with the imposed social distancing, those kids who thrive on socializing or sports are missing out on something very important. And we need to figure out how to give them that opportunity, whether it means a basketball game that doesn't involve, there's that game horse, where you just have to shoot in the basket. You don't have to be on top of each other, or something along those lines would be really important for a child like Shimon. And again, we have to stand up for someone like Shoshana. Missing out on that socializing is going to be more distressful to her than the average child. But interestingly enough, there are some children, and again, we're probably going to talk about that some more tomorrow, who actually thrived in this opportunity of not having to socialize and not having to interact so intensely with others. So, so we have to recognize that for some of the kids, going back to school, which we would think would be a positive attribute, is really going to be a cause for harm. I said, okay. Let me talk a little bit about, although I saw that you had a session on the internet. Let me just, by the way, ask one quick question. Do I end at 6 or do I end a few minutes before? I don't know if you're going to go straight from one to another. Does anybody help me there? No, nobody, no assistance. Okay. If I need to end, just inform me.
6 o'clock is when you end.
6 o'clock and go till 6. Okay.
Break until tomorrow. Let's not say it.
Okay. Yeah, right. Otherwise, whatever I don't cover, I'll continue tomorrow. Right. So here, if you look at this, again, this is one of my favorite cartoons. It shows very worried parents sitting with a child, say it's very important that you try very, very hard to remember where you electronically transferred mommy and daddy's assets. I mean, I think that captures the culture gap in terms of the internet. But the other thing that we have to deal with in terms of the anxiety of children, coming back to COVID, is that the manner and fashion in which both adults and children are acquiring information and processing information has changed radically in recent years. We're no longer dependent on the written media, no longer or dependent on the radio, the 2 radio stations that have news, or the 1 hour of news on the television show or television programming. Today we are bombarded with information and with many different types of media competing to get our attention. And one sure way to get somebody's attention is to sound very sensationalist and dangerous. So the manner and fashion in which children are getting information has changed, and therefore, and may be one of the reasons why there is so much more anxiety, because they are literally flooded. And then you add that if they are on social media and they're interacting with children from all over the world, any rumor or even any misconception or even any reality takes on much larger emphasis because it's so reinforced by the comments of the other children. So that's one important consideration. And if we are teaching children who, and I think there are very few that aren't using to some extent the internet and are relying on that for gathering information, you have to teach them how to skillfully use it. It's very important. It's interesting that I and Dave Pelkovitz are very much involved in training rabbis, doing mostly training and counseling and psychological matters, the rabbis at Yeshiva University. But this year, there's a certain subgroup of the rabbinic students, we're going to be giving them a class on how to communicate online and in social media, because many of them will be going to synagogues where that'll be the primary manner and fashion in which they're communicated. And there's a unique language, there's a unique way of doing that, there's unique legal issues. So they need to be, well versed in this area. So that's part of the concern. But the other thing is important, and here's where if we're addressing the anxiety and tension children will feel, what has happened as a result of the internet and technology is that parents are no longer, I'll follow the protocol here. With the onset of the internet use, there has been a change in the culture of childhood. No longer are adults the primary purveyors of information or the gatekeepers. In other words, until this generation, the adults were for the most part the ones who imparted information, and the adults, be it parents and teachers, were the gatekeepers. They determined what a child will know. And it was sort of mutual, it was a sort of a mutual understanding between the adults and the children, that there are some very confusing and sometimes perplexing situations that occur in this world. And we're not going to tell you, yeah, you're too young to know, and we don't want to know as kids. That's out the window, because today most children get their information by clicking a mouse. And therefore, not only are they finding out everything, but they feel entitled to know. This is extremely important, has huge bearing on the work that I do. Because in my work, when I have to notify families of terrible, tragic things, there are many times that I don't want a child to know something. I really wish that a child didn't have to know, but I have no choice to tell them, because if I don't tell them, they're going to find out from some other way, and they feel entitled to know. This was, by the way, I often mention, was the very big, most common question we got asked after the Leiby Kletsky murder. That if I had to paraphrase the question was, Dr. Blumenthal, I understand I have to tell my child that he was murdered. I understand that I have to, because it was on the news and everything. I have to tell him that the perpetrator was a member of our community. Do I have to tell him he was dismembered? It's so grotesque. So I created a mythical figure. I often I talk about it. He's called the big stupid kid on the bus. I even tell parents it's part of their tuition. You pay for a driver, a bus, and a big stupid kid. And I know them well. I raised two of them. And that's the kid who tells all the other children everything. And they're going to find out. If they're going to find out, I want them to find out from you. And the same thing is true in terms of COVID and the pandemic. They want to know, and they feel that they have a right to know. And therefore, we're in the somewhat disconcerting position as educators and parents to have to share information with children, not all, oftentimes what we wish they didn't have to know. So as we process the pandemic, and as we process, more importantly, and that's going to be part of the challenge, the fact that we don't know where it's going, we don't know if it's over, if it's not over, is it resurgence, is there herd immunity? As we enter into the school year with all this uncertainty, we're going to probably have to teach or give over information that we wish children didn't have to know. But if we're not going to do it, the big stupid kid on the bus will, and it's much better if it comes from responsible people. By the way, again, some people asked about the different ages, and I didn't really have time. Maybe I'll try to do it tomorrow. Very typical for, this is an important point, very typical for elementary school age children, particularly boys, is to want to know facts. They're very into facts. And if you're processing this, the situation with the pandemic in a class, let's say a 5th grade, a 3rd grade classroom, be prepared for the kids just to raise their hand and ask a lot of questions about, is it true? And I read, and is it true? And my big brother told me, and they're going to want, and that's okay. That's very typical for this age. And you answer the question as best you can and let them know that there's some things that we haven't quite figured out yet. Okay, ADHD and COVID. And again, this is a run for people with short attention span. Okay, what struck you about Avrami is how much better he did than most of his classmates during the remote learning. Barely able to sit in his seat, no less attend, he found the ability to tune in and out and learn while throwing a Nerf ball around his room ideally suited. How is he ever going to return, or should he? I'm not sure we'll have time to complete this, but let's try. Though sweet and endearing, Elke is constantly daydreaming and out of sync with her class. One second, I just saw something. Oh, there's a question. Let me see if I can get to that before we end. When the previous murderer you meant, I'm sorry, I don't know what that means. Okay, I'm not sure what that comment is. Anyway, sweet and endearing Elke is constantly daydreaming and out of sync with her class. If you're studying Chumash, you can be sure that she has her halacha book out, and vice versa. I think maybe I see another chat coming up, and maybe that person's clarifying. I'll take a quick look. Leiby Kletsky murder. Okay. All right. And vice versa. You are losing your patience with constantly having to remind her to wear her mask, distance, or hand sanitizer, even though she does it right away and apologizes when reminded. Okay, so as you know, ADHD, which is, by the way, the 3 most common referrals for children is ADHD, conduct disorder, and then anxiety. ADHD, if you don't know what it is, it's probably what was afflicting most of you while I was speaking, which is an inability to focus and pay attention, etc. But ADHD is characterized by restlessness, inattention, and impulsivity. And sometimes you have one and not the other. And interestingly enough, the restless children, these are one of the, we're going to talk about it maybe more tomorrow, there was a subset of children who did really well with the remote learning. And these are one of the kids who had, because they don't have to sit in the seat. And they might even be able to turn it off and turn the computer back on if it was, let's say, a recorded lesson. But as I indicated in my vignette, they can throw a Nerf ball around the room while they're learning. And so they, in many respects, had a better time and did better with remote learning than many of the other children, as we'll see. I'm not sure we'll see today, maybe we'll do that tomorrow, that the remote learning has not been terribly successful. The inattentive child needs refocusing and remote presence rarely suffice. In other words, let's say that the daydreamer, the space cadet, really is not daydreaming because they're oppositional like that. They just can't sustain their attention. And having a teacher present who can constantly bring them back to the material, even though it's hard, and the teacher who's teaching another 29 kids in the class, is easier done in the presence of the teacher than when it's done remotely, unless there's a parent or somebody sitting next to the child. And again, this is important in terms of teaching safety protocol. The inattentive child will also have a harder time remembering rules and expectations. Okay, I think I'm really sort of running out of time, so I just want, okay, so we really have two more sections that I need to cover, and we'll cover that tomorrow, but then we'll get into more of what to do. One is just a sort of an overall assessment of how the remote learning did these past few months, and it's not a very positive one. So it really was, I wouldn't say it's a flagrant failure, but there wasn't resounding success. And then I want to talk also, and that's, I guess I'll have to focus on that tomorrow a little bit, in terms of some of the tragedies that occurred, whether it was the illness or the death situation. I see a quick chat. Let me just see if that's, okay. Okay. Okay, someone asked if I could share the PowerPoint. I'm happy to share, but I probably want to take out some of the cartoons because I really didn't get a copyright, and therefore I'm not sure if I can disseminate them. But I can reformulate them, the material, even though the cartoons are the best part of it usually. But I'll just have to remove it and I'll send it to Kaplan. But certainly material, I'm very happy to share with everyone. Okay, I will continue. I'll try to continue tomorrow with again some assessment of the remote learning, the impact of the tragic situations, and get into some of the more what can we do. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. We'll give you a couple of reboot, and then we're back in the saddle again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Gute Nacht. Rabbi Shapiro is coming on at 8:30 in Hashem.
Okay.
Kol Tov, seid alle gesund.